in your talk today, because it's all related to the commodity of the data and how to really see the data as a key element in any AI approaches.
Yeah, well, I hope you find it interesting that I'm not going to be too technical. I particularly like the federated learning parts of Google TensorFlow, because I think that's pretty clearly the direction that people are going to be going, and that's where we do most of our work, is in privacy preserving tensor, federated learning.
Yes.
So it's just a fancy bunch of words.
Yeah, that's very true. For us, we need the Catgo community, and that's whole model of public data to support the growing AI projects out there. That help us a lot and also help the community. So I believe MIT is playing a big part with our Catgo community as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, now 10 already. So it's the time for event. So thank you, my dear friend, join the special event of United Nations Academic Impact at the Boston Global Forum today. We are today very honored to introduce Ramu Damodaran, Chief of United Nations Academic Impact. He is have great achievements with UN Academic Impact to build hub of academic impact, and also with 10 principles of United Nations Academic Impact. He also editor-in-chief of a special magazine of United Nations, that is UN Chronicle magazine. And Ramu Damodaran, I think he's a philosopher, my dear friend. We often chat and discuss about future UN 2045 initiative. He will talk about that. And today you can see that we have great professor in science and Michael Dukakis Institute, and also he's co-founder of special initiative that is the AI Open Society Innovation Network. He is a co-author of Social Contract 2020, new social contract in the age of AI, and he is have new concept, new model, new term that is the Trustworthy economy. He will present today and contribute for us for this event. Thanks so much, UN Academic Impact.
Today, the 24th of July, is in some ways an important anniversary, because it was on this day in 1847 that a Nguyen, Richard March Poe, got the patent for the first rotary printing press. 13 years, he'd been able to develop press to 18,000 readers every minute in terms of production of the newspaper. And I highlight this to show how over the period of history, the society has evolved, because it was his learning, his innovation, his willingness to experiment that created what we now take so much for granted, and what, in a sense, we are anticipating with the development of artificial intelligence, which allows us to sense what a reader wants, what a consumer wants and what, above all, the people of the world want. And that really requires the element, which is the highlight of Dr. Pentland's talk, the element of trust, the idea of building a trustworthy economy. Dr. Pentland has often spoken, and has spoken very eloquently, about data, and he is the academic director of the Data POP initiative, which many of us in the United Nations are fortunate to work with and to be associated with. And I think that sums up in a sense where we are in the world today, particularly in an academic context. Because data is by definition objective. Intelligence, whether human or artificial, is subjective. But there is no reason why the two should not work hand in hand and be able to take advantage of each other. That said, the one element which has consistently eroded over the last 20 years, or the last quarter century, is trust. Trust between citizens themselves, trust between citizens and their governments, and I dare say, in many cases, trust between citizens and governments and the United Nations. And so we do need that trustworthy economy. And I'm most grateful for the opportunity we will have to hear from Dr. Pentland on how exactly this could be done. Dr. Pentland's, I'm not sure what the phrase would be, sir, whether it be research director or guide, the great Whitman Richards, had once said that in the 60s, with the advent of accessible computer technology, the development of information theory and the electrode, there was renewed excitement about the prospects for modeling and understanding both mind and brain. Now, this is something that Dr. Richards had said so many years ago, referring to a period of time when the United Nations was barely 20 years old, and when, looking back, was more than 60 years ago or so. But what he said could really be adapted to the world today, to the economy about which Dr. Pentland will speak, to the idea that in anything we do, we can deal with data, we can deal with facts, we can deal with projections and predictions, but ultimately, we have to bring in the human mind. And also, above all, what Dr. Richard said, that sense of excitement. Because unless academics and academicians excite the public, excite the United Nations, and we can do so much together, then we risk moving further and further into cloistered spaces where we work, we are proud of our achievement, but we are not heard. So it's in that communion of hearing that I welcome all of you today and ask you first to lend your ears to Dr. Pentland. My privilege to welcome you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. That's really elegant. And I'm glad to hear about that you know who Whitman Richards is, because he was a great man in many ways. So let's see here. We're going to get a presentation, which is, oops, just a second. This silly thing wants to, there. Great, okay. So Tuan encouraged me to talk about the big issue, which is trust. If you had to look at one thing in our societies that is underpinning a lot of the malaise, it's the lack of trust. That means that we can't cooperate with each other. It means that we can't build institutions. We can't find the way forward. Just a word about my background. So many years ago, I started a discussion at Davos with world leaders and industry leaders that eventually produced the GDPR, the Protection Acts, through the presence of people like the Minister of Justice for the EU and the head of the American Federal Trade Commission. And I was honored to be part of what the Secretary General of the UN called the Data Revolution and sit on the board of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is really about how to use data and AI to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I run a group at MIT, which is sponsored by several countries that are interested in these issues of data and better governance through the use of data, through transparency and through reinventing their society, and work with the various institutions that you see at the bottom there. So a good place to start is the current situation. Everybody is familiar with the metaphor of data as the new oil, which is not a great metaphor, but everybody knows it. And everybody is also concerned about the fact that there's just a few companies that control most of this, and that people's individual rights to data seem to be trammeled in this world. And there seems to be no way forward. And this undermines a lot of the trust in AI and newer systems, and makes it difficult to agree on the facts, because now all data is suspect. And I think sort of the core of that is that data and AI are now a major means of production. They're like labor or capital or land. And those major means of production have to be part of a social contract. We need a deal. In my phrase, the New Deal on data. We need a deal between citizen and government and companies about who owns what and how it can be used. And we're working towards that slowly and fitfully, and we're hampered by a lot of understanding, particularly by the citizenry, for which all of this is sort of dark arts and not understandable. So it's extremely scary. In thinking about incorporating data and AI into the social contract, people often use the metaphor of money, but that's not actually how data works. Data is very different in a number of ways. It's only valuable in the aggregate, whereas a dollar is worth a dollar. Value of data depends on the context. It's worth something here, it's not worthy in that other place. The value expires over time, very often. And what people actually give away is control of the data, not possession. It's not like you no longer have your data if you let somebody use it, you still have it. So it's very different. And in many ways, it's more like land than money. You give people access rights to your land, you own the land. Its value depends on the people around you. It's inherently a social thing. If you're in the middle of the city, it's worth more than if you're in the middle of a desert. And so we need to begin thinking about this in its correct format and not posing data and AI just in terms of money. It's one of the things that irritates me most about the World Economic Forum in Davos is everybody uses this money markets thing to think about policy. But life is much richer than that. And thinking of everything in terms of money is a major force in breaking society apart and devaluing a lot of the things that make us human. The consequence of all that is that we need new institutions. So we need digital identity and ownership rights. So these are part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's hard to realize in the United States or Western Europe, but a very large fraction of the world's total population have no presence in their government. They're not counted. They're not helped as a consequence. No one knows their conditions. They don't have opportunity to move themselves forward. And in this new world where all the government systems are run by computers and data, they'll be missing completely. So that needs to happen. We also need to audit and hold things accountable. So that's a lot of the current emphasis on AI is bias, accountability. And we do things for several countries. For instance, we just helped the country of Colombia audit their social programs and are doing the same thing in Mexico. And finding that in the same things that cause the bias, there's also the power to cure the bias, to make sure that you reach everybody. because now you can see this picture of your nation in a way that was never possible before. This is sort of the key idea of the Sustainable Development Tier 3 goals, is to be able to measure all the parts of the social contract: inequality, sustainability, all the things that matter to human quality of life, so that we can make sure that government and companies and individuals are doing the right thing. There also needs to be a criminal system, of course. Now, this need is not a new thing to us. 150 years ago, there was a real novelty in having commercial banking, particularly in places like the US and parts of Europe. And there was exploitation of people by these new banks. They would go bust, they were unregulated, they were crazy. And what ended up happening is that we put in place financial regulations about banks, accountability, audit by the government, criminal systems to bring them under control. 100 years ago, the same issues were around labor. Big corporations suddenly were industrializing the entire nation. People were moving from the farms to the cities, and big corporations were exploiting people. And so there needed to be pushback where people had rights to their labor, the rights to negotiate. That's where labor unions come from. Audit and accountability, safety regulations were put in place for the first time, and of course, criminal penalties. So today, instead of banks or labor unions, we need something like data unions, collectives of people that pool their data, their ownership of data, which they have the rights to under GDPR, CPP, and HIPAA, to be able to get a fair deal from these new systems, to be able to hold them accountable. And those are political institutions. They're not just regulatory. These are people being able to enunciate their needs and enforce things. This is what happened in this country with the Grange and farm collectives, farm banks. This is what happened and where credit unions came from. This is where labor unions came from 50 years later. And today, what I am seeing and working with are people like international associations of labor unions, to be able to have the members of labor unions take control of their data to help consumers, the International Association of Consumers. Every country has a different one. And the thing that's interesting here is that this is not about money. Sometimes money is an issue, of course, but much more is important is, are the hospitals giving you the right treatments? Are they doing public health? We've seen in this pandemic great inequalities in terms of death rates and infection rates. And some of that is due to economic things, but more of it is due to failures in health systems, failures in public health systems. But each community does not know what's being done in their community. They don't have possession of their data to be able to push back. And so what I'm seeing, is that local collectives, neighborhood by neighborhood collectives, are beginning to pool data from the people. So this is not just sending out questionnaires to people. People can collect data on their phones, put it in a bank where they don't give up ownership of it, but it's held just like the credit union holds your data. They don't own your data. And this local collective can begin pushing back. And we're beginning to see this. And I think this is a great way forward. One of the most exciting things is I see large organizations, the largest investment funds, I see national governments beginning to think about how can we use community level data, these local political action groups that have the rights to possess data, to help them rebuild and to get the fair deal that they need. And the science for this has changed dramatically. This is AI and data together. For instance, we've now shown on 4 continents that you can do a tremendously better job at predicting economic growth in a neighborhood. It has to do with diversity. So it has to do with the diversity of amenities and stores that the government and other people and investment firms can invest in. It has to do with transportation networks. But using that, we can predict amazingly accurately year-on-year economic growth of neighborhoods. So if you want to invest in a neighborhood to bring it up to par with everybody else, we now have a recipe that's dramatically better than we've ever had before. We've been able to show in several countries that we can even predict sales for stores that don't yet exist, and we can do it as well as stores that do exist. What that means is you can say, if we put a grocery store there, how well will it do? And the way you do that is through data, the community's data, not, again, the way you think of it in terms of questionnaires about preferences, but where do people work? Where do they shop? What are the sort of income distribution they have? You don't need data to do these things that are privacy, that attack privacy. You can do it with aggregate data, but you need to have available these sorts of things. And so what we're doing in places like Australia and Switzerland and Luxembourg is we're beginning to help them think about reconstruction after COVID, thinking to use these sort of data and community techniques to be able to rebuild.
Alex, by the way, your slides are cut off.
Cut off in what way?
The top and bottom.
Well, it's just going to be that way because I'm not going to reinvent Google. Okay. Sorry. Hopefully you can see something. So I'll share the slides afterwards. Another thing that we've been able to do is show that we can predict outcomes with factors that will actually help children succeed. And we can potentially do that almost 10 times better than has been in the past. So social services can also be data-driven, and they're driven by community data. Again, communities that possess data. To make this sort of vision of the future happen, we've put together several entities. So we work with Ernst & Young and the World Bank on a thing called the Prosperity Collaborative, which is trying to help countries around the world upgrade their national systems. And I'm pushing to make this also the local systems, the community systems, to have better tax collection, but also better investment and better social support. I've also put together an alliance of law schools around the world because law is often a barrier to these things. And law.mit.edu is a place where you can see the ongoing discussion about how law has to evolve to make data and AI part of the social contract. So I'd urge you to take a look there. And finally, as was mentioned by Tuan, I have a new book called Building the New Economy. It's open, free at MIT. This is the URL. If you just Google Building New Economy, Pentland, you can find it. I wouldn't try to copy down the URL right there. So I'm going to stop there. And I think we're back. Is that right? Can you see me again?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Great. So yeah, I'm sorry that was cut off. Like I say, I don't know what to do about that, but I will send around the slides so that you can see things. And hopefully that was interesting. It was really, the core is, look, you know, we've been here with capital. That's where banks and credit unions came from. Local political action to create local possession. That's where labor unions came from 50 years later. And now we're at a point where these sort of local communities can take a ownership of their data to be able to guide their path forward. And I think that actually really changes a lot of the pictures, because that, together with the sort of AI techniques and the science that's been developed about guiding local investment, can really give communities a chance to develop themselves in a way that they haven't been able to do before. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for showing up and listening.
No, thank you. I'm really grateful, and I'm also very struck by your being able to bring in what is, in many senses, a very rich but conceptual idea to the practical grassroots, as cited with Colombia. And I think this is really going to be the future of the United Nations, working with the global scholar community to try and take ideas which are so inherently powerful and bring them to bear on very, very specific finite situations and make a change. I think what we would probably do now is to, I know that many of us in the virtual room we're in will have questions and ideas to share with Dr. Pentland. I would like to take the liberty of calling upon some of you as discussants, since I know you're here, for you to share your thoughts and then in the process also comment upon or ask Dr. Pentland any questions that you may have. And maybe if I may ask, suggest Dr. Pentland, you could respond to these collectively towards the end, because there might be things that you wish to cluster together.
Sure, so that sounds great. Let's have a discussion and I'll chime in at the end.
Absolutely, and please, of course, feel free to interrupt or intervene in the discussion at any point if there's something that you feel should be made right then. Thank you. Let me begin by inviting Dr. Mark Rotenberg, who's the director of the Michael Dukakis Institute. And Tuan and I had talked about this, and Tuan suggested that maybe you could talk about laws and policies which would be relevant for the trustworthy economy that Dr. Pentland made reference to. So, Dr. Rotenberg?
Hi, Mark.
I think
You're muted still, Mark. You're muted.
Okay, you can hear me now, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Just a brief clarification. Of course, Tuan is the director of the Michael Dukakis Institute. We have launched a new program, which is the Center for AI and Digital Policy, and that's what I'll be heading up. I also wanted to thank Sandy for an excellent presentation and actually note two critical points that he made at the outset that have framed much of the discussion. A key point that he makes is the need to establish trust, to maintain trust, that particularly in the digital environment, policymakers have identified trust as one of the preeminent themes going forward. So I think that's a key point. The second point which he makes about privacy and data policy, which I also think is correct, is that we're speaking generally about control as opposed to possession. And his analogy to land and not money makes a great deal of sense because, of course, modern day privacy law deals with a somewhat paradoxical goal of protecting a person's personal data when it by someone else. Because you see, if your data is in your possession, you can protect it by physical means. So what law and policy seek to do is to protect your personal data when it's held by a doctor, a financial institution, or an internet company. So these points, I think, are important. As for the use of data for financial purposes, what I have described as monetization, this is somewhat controversial. Some of you may know the former presidential candidate Andrew Yang has proposed in effect that people should be compensated for the use of their personal data. And there are a lot of people who are drawn to that model, who see in the collection and use of personal data the opportunity from one perspective to more fairly allocate the revenue that's generated. But it's a complicated concept, in part because it's difficult to assign to a particular individual the actual value of the use of their information. And I think the more critical point, as scholars and others have pointed out, is that privacy is oftentimes almost a procedural right. It's a right to be treated fairly when decisions are made about you for employment, for example, or for credit, or for education. It's not the monetary interest in the use of your personal information that's preeminent. It's the fair use of your information in a way that's accountable and transparent. So, this is a very interesting area. As I said, it's certainly received a lot of attention. I don't think there's a consensus yet about how personal data would be used for monetary purposes. But let me just briefly now highlight a couple of recent developments that I think are relevant to the conversation as we talk about new institutions and the role of law and policy. As some of you may know, there was a very important decision last week from the Court of Justice of the European Union in a case that the Austrian privacy advocate Max Schrems had brought, challenging the transfer of personal data by Facebook from Ireland to the United States using what are called standard contractual clauses. And Schrems alleged that this particular legal technique did not provide an equivalent protection that he would otherwise receive as a European Union citizen. And the top court in the European Union, which is the Court of Justice, agreed with him. The practical consequences of what is now the second Schrems case, the first one was in 2015, are potentially enormous. They strongly suggest that the current basis of data flows, particularly in the high-tech sector from Europe to the US and to other countries, other third-party countries, could be limited if those countries fail to provide privacy protection that's essentially equivalent to what is provided by, as Sandy described, the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. It's too soon to say what the practical consequences will be of the Schrems decision. I think it's unlikely that US and EU policymakers will try to put in place a policy framework similar to the Safe Harbor or the Privacy Shield, both of which were annulled by the top court in Europe. But I will say, in support of the work that Sandy has described, this is a tremendous moment, really an opportunity to put forward new ideas about privacy protection, and particularly the use of personal data in the global sphere. So the timing right now is actually about as good as it could be for new approaches and new recommendations. And just a final point on AI and personal data. Growing realities for policymakers is an awareness that the collection of personal data poses risk. And it poses risk not simply because we can't always determine whether the outcomes are beneficial, but it poses risks, unfortunately, because we live in a world where national governments as adversaries target the personal data held by other governments and companies in other jurisdictions. And for that reason, this issue quickly goes into the realm of cybersecurity, and I believe a growing recognition that where it's possible to other purposes, I think we move then to a better place on a curve of choice. So I'm going to stop there. As I said, very good presentation, very good moment to explore new ideas. Some challenge to the concept of monetization, but also a real opportunity to move forward AI-based models that are less dependent on the collection of personal data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rottenberg. And I think we all would be taken by that idea of probably in a phrase, the depersonalization of AI. And I think your idea of having it structured on models rather than particular targets, specifically individual or community targets, is something that should certainly be explored in the context of our larger continuing discussion on this theme as we go forward to what Tuan calls Unleashed 2045. Let me now invite Bill Ottman, who is the co-founder and CEO of Minds.com. Mr. Ottman, could you join us? Thank you, sir.
Hey, thank you for having me. And thank you, Dr. Pentland. That was really fascinating. So a few items, in terms of trust and this idea of trust around data and privacy, it is true that we want to trust as we're using decentralized zero knowledge systems that disable companies from even being able to become bad actors or get hacked. So, especially in the blockchain sphere, trustlessness is really the new buzzword. And I think it's really important to be aware of. And then in terms of AI and, really all software systems that if it's not open source, then there is no possible way to understand if the application that you're interfacing with is respecting your freedom and your privacy. So I think that this isn't really talked about enough, because for most people, just the phrase open source is a little bit confusing. But, comparing it more, I think, to, you brought up land and I think comparing it to food systems and food transparency makes it more visceral for people to understand. The organic food movement rose up, and people really started being able to latch onto this idea, like, I want to know what's in my food, or I want there to be some sort of accountability for food companies to have to be transparent about what's inside the food. And I think the same thing really does apply with tech and understanding, like, is this company respecting my freedom? Maybe a normal consumer is not going to go in and inspect the code, but if it's open source, then it's able to be inspected. And that's really essential. So, and I'm for Dr. Pentland, when he gets a chance to respond later, I'm really curious your thoughts about licensing models for data and what really makes sense in, and where open data plays into that versus licensing structures for data where, you fully own the data, but it gets pretty complicated because there's different types of, there's more public data, there's personal data. So I'm very curious your thoughts there. And then lastly, on the monetization of data, I think that there is good reason to be very skeptical of this, but at the same time, I think it's potentially very exciting, because the status quo with big tech, big social, is that, you get nothing. They take all the data. You can't even pay them a subscription fee to stop spying on you. There's no possible way to get compensated for really anything that you're doing. Your participation and your value is extracted, and none of that value is given back to the users or community. So I think, what you mentioned about Yang's proposal about paying users for data, if implemented effectively, could be interesting. There's already my company, Minds, does this in a similar way to the browser, the Brave browser, which is an open source, privacy focused internet browser. And basically, I would just argue that it's about consent based systems. So as long as the user is the one deciding that, hey, I'm willing to share this data about myself in exchange for X, and I'm making that decision in a clear and open way, and you're giving me that choice. It's an opt-out by default system. So the status quo is opt-in by default with no way to opt out. So places like Brave and Minds, we have more of an opt-out by default with consent, and then we will help monetize data with various cryptocurrency and whatnot. So and then I just think that with a lot of these new systems, AI especially, we really have to insist on it being open. And I know that there's OpenAI is doing good work in this area, but if we're going to have AI systems powering global infrastructure and even in little devices in our homes, we need to insist that these systems be opened up so that there can be accountability with regards to what's happening. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. This is exactly the conversation that we need to be having. So cheers.
Thanks so much, Mr. Hoffman. Thank you. And that's a fascinating idea, the idea of both consent and compensation, or consent with compensation, and also leaving the tenor and the nature of that compensation to be decided. Let me now invite Anders Kaur, who leads the Core Analytics. Mr. Kaur?
Thank you so much. It's just great that the UN and BGF are working together on cyber AI and their complement trust. World citizenship and the SDGs in education is a long-term goal and ideal of many. It's great to hear Ramu, Sandy, Mark, and Bill speak so intelligently on these issues. Yes, we need more privacy, including auditing from collective bargaining on data rights. Yes, people should band together to protect and control their data. But why should we have data unions rather than allow our democratic governments to regulate our data for the good of all? If not, the wealthiest are likely to have their own higher class data union, and the poor may have lower class data unions in which they get less for their data than do the wealthy. A democratic state-based data union of all people within a state, or even internationally, gives the individual more bargaining power and more egalitarian distribution of benefits. As we are applying these lessons internationally, I think it ought to be mentioned that we can't treat all countries the same. Some countries are totalitarian dictatorships and some are democracies. I believe that we can and should trust democracies to empower them against the dictators. Until we have trust based on democracy and human rights, as enshrined in the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we will not have the trust required to further empower the UN on these matters. China and its allies are the world's worst human rights abusers and the worst violators of data privacy. They go and steal millions of private data, for example, the 22 million OPM records likely stolen from the US by China in 2015. That theft continues today. According to the UN definition of genocide, China is engaging in genocide today against Turkic Muslims, not to mention ongoing repression against Tibetans, Falun Gong, and Christians. So we can't treat the country like other countries. The CCP will never allow data unions of its citizens to collectively bargain against state-controlled telecom and social media companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Kaur. I think it's one of the perennial questions that the United Nations faces about how to make the institutional organization more inclusive or more exclusive of governments and nations that do not subscribe to a particular point of view. And I think that's a matter for a very thorough and rich conversation in itself. So I'm most grateful for your thoughts on that. Let me now invite Marcel Zuter, who is the chairman of Power Invest. Mr. Zuter.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Dr. Pentland for the great presentation, also showing new ways to look at these things, everything concerning data. Now, for me, I guess there is kind of three themes that are key to the question around trust and how can we kind of further build up trust to make sure that society is willing to kind of organization around transparency. How do you create transparency around the whole topic of data? I would bet that a big part of Europe, citizens in Europe, wouldn't know about that general data protection law. They maybe see it popping up in the form of kind of internet pages that ask if they can use the data or place cookies, but they're not really aware of that. So I think a big part of the effort and energy should be put into kind of institutionalizing to create transparency. And the second topic, I think, is how do we find kind of a general agreement in society on certain issues? I guess the Boston Global Forum's idea about the social contract shows the way that we should be thinking about that. But in the end, I guess democratic societies should have in their constitutions some part that defines on what can be done around data. Not in detail, but I'll give you an example, and it was kind of touched on that as well by Dr. Pentland. Who owns the data? I'm not really sure how I define that. I give data away, I get services for that when I do a search somewhere or all kinds of other things. I understand that, but I cannot get my data back. And I think in areas where you have a very, very high hurdle of people having to have trust, like health, sharing health data, my personal health data, I want to be sure that at any point in time, when I give data to an organization, an institution, or a union, I want to be sure I can pull that data back and they delete everything. Now, the models today of these big institutions that really systematically gather data is not built around that. It's not built around giving data back, deleting everything. It's technically not possible, is the argument very often. But I guess it's a key element that we really think on a constitutional level around what are these 2 or 3 sentences that over time should be put in there to make sure it is defined on what is essentially data and how is the individual kind of having rights around data. And then I guess the third point, and I'm glad Dr. Pentland, after kind of his initial statement of that in Davos, most people think that about everything is like money. I was a bit worried. I come out of the world of money, but you, I guess, with your thought around data unions that are kind of similar to the money unions that were created 100 years ago, made me hopeful that I can still kind of bring the third part in, which is, I guess, the financial markets are really kind of something very interesting to compare to and look to in history and draw conclusions. Why? Because I think next to health, the other thing that people are really kind of want to have some higher degree of trust is finance. My health is something that I really want to make sure that I can trust these institutions. So I guess that whole market structure that was created over 150 years, stock exchanges and all kinds of companies, privately owned companies, publicly owned companies that move around in this market, create innovation, etc. That is something, I guess, that is really worthwhile looking into how to kind of deal with data. And data unions are a great example of that. My challenge is looking at history is, where do you start? Do you start with regulation, or do you start with structure, or do you start with processes, or do you wait for that and to see kind of how the markets develop, how innovation is being created, how ideas come up on small scale, like again, that's data unions. And then after a while, you start kind of putting in regulation, or you try to put in regulation fairly quickly to give security to society, to kind of raise the trust level within society. So that's something I'm struggling with. What do you do when? When do you do the right steps to kind of not hamper the development, but at the same time give security by defining boundaries, regulatory boundaries, boundaries by constitution, by law. So I will be very interested, Dr. Penn, on that also in terms of how do you sequence that? How do you see that being sequenced? So with that, I give back. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Mr. Zuta. And I was very taken by that idea of structures versus processes. What should come first? And actually at the United Nations, we've, I think, experimented with both. We've had sets of processes which then cohese or define themselves into a workable structure, which has often worked very well. At times it's been infirm. Or we have begun with a structure and then had the processes come after that. But I think that this is something which, as you said quite rightly, is something which is particularly compelling in the context of the subject that we are discussing this morning. So thank you. Thanks so much for that. Let me now call upon Alan Citron, who is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Mr. Citron, could you join us?
Yes, can you hear me, please?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Wonderful. So I very much like the model and the metaphor that Dr. Pentland is using. I would volunteer to add to it by suggesting that based on his model, we citizens today, we persons today are all data slaves, or at the very least data serfs. but we are not data citizens. But when I look at the problem of how do you take an action on something like this, I keep getting stuck in the definition of, well, what constitutes personal data or my data? I mean, I can understand something that identifies me and can be used for theft of identity is my data, but there's so much ambient data that we generate in our lives. Is there some structure or framework that will help us understand what data we are actually talking about so that we can then take actions and transform the relationship between our data, whatever that means, and the value that industrialists get out of monetizing our data? So just that thought or question, please.
Thank you so much. And I am sure that Dr. Pentland, in the course of our conversation after the discussants have spoken, will address that and as well as other points made in this. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me now invite Anders Hjort Agerskov, who is the lead of the public sector section in the World Bank. Ms. Agerskov.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a great presentation, as always, Sandy. I have just two observations. One is, how do we take this dialogue into a broader group? Because we are, in some sense, the global elite on this. And should we push the idea of a citizen guide to privacy, disinformation, cybersecurity, and so on, as a way to kind of inoculate the population against disinformation and what have you, and educate a broader set of society? It may only be the next layer of policymakers and bots and so on, but to bring it out a little bit broader. The second thing is the issue of anonymity versus transparency. So having worked on financial crimes for a number of years, we know anonymity is a big problem because you can hide enormous stolen wealth. So we're pushing very much for transparency around these issues. On the other side is the whole privacy agenda, where we're saying, well, you have the right to not having this kind of information disclosed and so on. So how do we manage that? And a subset of that that we haven't really brought up, what are the rights of individuals versus companies and organizations, right? So we have talked, I think, very much from kind of the individual perspective, but maybe we can have different standards for companies. And I think the key thing, as Sandy also pointed out, is the governance. There's an utter lack of governance because so many things are happening at once. So maybe the approach is, as also Sandy implied, is to take a piece step by step where we see there are some opportunities for making practical progress. So thank you very much for a most interesting debate.
Thanks so much, Mr. I think brings into play the other we are privileged to have in this conversation. Thank you, sir. Let me now invite Barry Nolan, who's a senior advisor to the US Congress. Mr. Nolan?
I think the idea of focusing this on trust is brilliant, because the history of people's intersection with issues of money is learned not to trust collateralized. And now we're suggesting they trust something they really don't have much of a chance of understanding. And this comes at the same time when we have a political climate in this country where we disengage from the World Health Organization. What can trusted organizations like MIT do to help people understand that this is trustworthy? Can you, for instance, publish examples of how you predicted the success of this community economic development, and lo and behold, you were spot on? Can you make predictions for the future and then give yourself a scorecard? What can you do to help build trust that is in short supply?
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's actually a fascinating idea. Must one understand in order to be able to trust? I think in many cases, right from childhood, but I dare say in later years as well, one tends to want to trust what one does not fully understand. A humanities student who trusts what an astronomer says or a biologist says and so on. But I think you make a very good point there, Mr. Nolan, and thank you for that. Let me now invite Jerry Saviono, MIT Global Science Fellow, and also a global tax innovation expert. Mr. Saviano?
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate opportunity to join this forum today. And I'd like to refer back to Dr. Pentland's presentation and the part where he talked about the Prosperity Collaborative. We work very closely with MIT, Dr. Pentland, and Boston Global Forum with Tuan, and you just heard from Anders Agerskov. I also want to continue with this discussion about trust. And if we look at government institutions and perhaps the area where there's the most significant lack of trust is in the area of taxation. And we're very interested in the extension of these data-driven principles and insights to the world of tax. We believe that policymakers oftentimes are deriving their taxing policies perhaps without the benefit of rich data sets. And also, as Dr. Pentland mentions, the collection of data. Are they simply collecting data fairly and equitably? We learn of something called tax morale. How interested people are in paying their taxes principally depends upon if they believe the system is fair and just. So continuing with this notion of trust, we believe that there's an application of greater use of rich data fields to create better taxing policies, and we're really excited about that work. I also want to just highlight that I believe one of the gaps in the system, still we don't have global institutions to manage application of data and AI systems in this example to the world of taxation. And we think that there is a massive opportunity in the world for somebody, some organization to step up and provide the governance that's necessary to apply that data outside of one jurisdiction, do it in a privacy preserving, safely and securely. So we think that it's very young in the application of data to the world of taxation, but we think it's an important issue and an important area to apply these principles. So thank you again for inviting me today.
Thank you so much for bringing in that dimension, and I think it's a critical one. And the idea of taxation in the mix also brings in both the large number of people in the world who, by their very economic nature, are untaxed or are not required to be taxed, but also the responsibility both of taxpayers and the government to make sure that the equity and the equitability that we try and drive in this at this time is assured through adequate resources. So thank you so much for that. It's now my honor to invite a distinguished member of one of the founding members of Impact, the University of New York's graduate school, Dr. Lyndon Haviland, who is the director of the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and the Public Health Institute. Dr. Haviland? Dr. Haviland, are you with us, sir?
Lyndon, please. I tell Lyndon in my phone 201, something like that. That is Lyndon. Oh, maybe she doesn't hear. Okay, so I think Ramu, you can continue. Yep. Maybe
right. Well, if Dr. Haviland is able to join us, I'm sure that he would intervene, and we'd welcome that. But let me now, I think, go back to both you, Tuan, and Dr. Pentland for your reactions and comments on the wonderful interventions that we've heard this morning. I think it's been a very, very well choreographed program, Tuan, because we've had so many distinctive perspectives, each of which has generated an idea and certainly many questions. So if I may, let me begin with Dr. Pentland and your thoughts on the discussion, sir.
So great points all around here. let me just begin with a little aside, which is that if you look at my book, it's all about blockchain and things. Okay, so yes, these new computer science things that give you much greater security are urgently needed, not just from a trust point of view, people having trust, but also from a cyber attack point of view. And there are things that are happening in that space. Like, for instance, Singapore just announced a digital currency that's competitive with the China digital currency. That's going to put at risk the place of the West in terms of having a reserve currency. We are going to have, I mean, you haven't seen nothing yet there. So one point that's on the technical side, and then I'll get to actually the parts that matter, is that it's now possible to derive models without sharing data, full stop, period, without having legal possession of the data. It's called federated learning, a thing called swipe, how you interface with it. What it does is it phones home a completely secure thing to a central position, which tries to optimize for new events and things like that, sends it back to you. Nobody sees your data, ever. It's just impossible, provably impossible. And that's the sort of thing that just changes the discussion. And we've gotten the Eurostat to adopt this framework. We call it open algorithms, where you know exactly what is being asked of your data. You never share your data under any circumstances. And you know what answers are given back and what inferences can be made. That's all now possible. It can be standardized. There are good initial versions of this in countries like Estonia. And as I said, you know, the EU has adopted this as a framework for its official statistics. But the understanding and use of it needs to propagate. The bigger issue, though, is about people, trust, informed consent. Data is complicated. Data is changing. When we had the initial discussions at Davos that led to GDPR, it was very clear that data is more complicated than money. And nobody can be relied on to manage their own money. That's why we have banks and investment funds and mutual funds. There need to be these institutions that help people do that and understand it. The history of those sorts of institutions is starting local, and then as different communities develop different ideas, this is what happened with the banking, the agricultural cooperatives in the sort of mid to late 1800s. This is what happened with the labor unions around 1900. We don't know what the best regulation is. There's certain basic things which we certainly do. GDPR, CPP, clearly in the right direction. There's other sorts of things that have to do with being able to audit things to avoid bias and misuse that are not yet in place that clearly need to be there, right? And one of the things about federated learning is it makes auditing really easy, makes it automatic. So I think what needs to happen is a political process where communities become informed about these things, about the things they possess, and what can be done with it. I disagree with the monetary thing because I don't know anybody that would take the couple $100 a year we're talking about and trade that for the life of their son or their grandfather. And yet in the pandemic, we've seen that certain communities have 4 times the fatality rate of other communities. That means people are dying, their families are dying, because nobody knew that their public health, that their medical systems were different and inadequate. And the same is true of schooling. The same is true of many sort of outcomes like that. And I think it's just universally hand down. It's those sorts of things that really matter. The positive thing is, for instance, I was just on a call with the head of Goldman Sachs, the CEO of Barclays, many other big banks like that. And they see an urgent need for their own purposes to begin investing in communities. And there's a complicated, well, not so complicated, argument about why financial institutions have to change. Financial institutions not to be good, but to survive. Because we are going to entering a high inflation, high real inflation, low interest environment. Banks can't survive in that area. They have to begin investing in real assets in various ways. And what that's going to require to do that intelligently is knowing a lot more about the investments, about whether the grocery store is actually going to survive, whether there needs to be a school here. Things like that are going to drive the profitability of banks in the view of these heads of these large international banks. And you can now do this. We publish, I forget who asked about, can we publish this? Yes, we've published studies showing that we can predict economic growth on cities in 4 continents. We've done predicting store for future stores on on 2 continents, I think it is now. You know, and we're just one group. Many people are beginning to do these things. So there's a need to communicate these new possibilities and the new sort of economic realities that are driving community ownership of data to be a tremendously important thing. Again, to reiterate, we've often posed this sort of ownership of data in terms of individual terms and money, but owning my data is worth very little to me. The actual monetization of it is a couple $100 a month. It's aggregate data that allows you to derive statistical inferences. You cannot derive it from individuals, full stop. So what is that aggregate going to be? Well, it could be national. We could make national data cooperatives, right? But as we've just seen, there's a tendency to leave out minority communities, poor communities. What about poor nations around the world, right? They may need different things than we, sitting in our elite institutions, believe that they need. And so they should have a voice. They should be able to have ability to act and guide what happens to them. And that requires that they aggregate their resource, this new means of production, to be able to guide investment and policy in their communities. Obviously, like with the banking system, like with the labor, you need national and even international regulation. You need guidelines so they don't go off in the wrong direction. But you also need to listen to the voice of the communities. So I guess that's my my little statement about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pentland. Thank you for that. And I know it's probably provoked even more thinking and thoughts from our community here and those who will be watching this later. And we hope that that's something we can elaborate upon in a later session, which Tuan organizes. We still have a couple of minutes. So Tuan, could I ask you to round up this very rich discussion?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your great support and organization. And UN academic impact is a great achievement, and also we have great event here, and we continue to organize more this series. And always Dr. Ramu Damodaran is the moderator of our United Nations 2045 Initiative Roundtable, and we hope we can do that. Our discussion today continue discuss this topic in new term, a new model for economy, trustworthy economy, and we are very honored to receive our many opinions and comments. I think that's great. And we are Boston Global Forum, Michael Dukakis Institute, and AI Society Innovation Network will collect and will discuss with Professor Alex Pentland. And I have new idea of an act, and I discussed with Professor Alex Pentland already. That means Professor Alex Pentland talked about that the data is as a land, as a great value for any people, and also contribution of our people for society, special volunteers and dedication. Also, that is very great value. And now we don't, in the world, we don't have any system to value them, and so we can by this new but it also trustworthy economy with new value system we can put together with data that is the social reward value. That is, we recognize people as Ramu Damodaran. He is the lead for UN economic impact, great achievement, great contribution for the world. So how to respect and reward him as a great value, for he can exchange, can use it for service and products in the society. That is our ideas, and I discussed with Professor Alice Pentland already, and we continue to develop. And also today is a historical day for the trustworthy economy. It's a new term, and all of us here today continue discuss and build that a new model, new concept. I hope and I believe and I trust our great brand today. Our discussion is great brand today. Continue discuss in online and mail discussion together with Professor Alice Pentland and also with Ramu Damodaran and Boston Global Forum, AIWS.net. Thank you so much. And after open and first event, that is the UN Chapter Day, June 26th. That is the second event, and we will continue invite great figures, great speakers to talk for safe future of UN, and some professor talk that we reinvent UN at 100 years, 2045 for the professor. And thank you so much for my dear friend Ramu Damodaran. Thank you so much and highly respect to United Nations economic impact, and we see and meet and discuss next event, August event. Thank you so much, Ramu.
Thank you so much, Tuan. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I mentioned at the beginning what the idea of the 24th of July and the significance in history. I also realized that today is a date which most of the world is written as 24/7, 24/7, while in the United States it's 7/24. And I think that's in some ways a summation of the possibilities we discussed today, because while all of the world is living 24/7, that is, their entire days and lives and weeks are spent in sustaining themselves and making life possible and productive, in earning money in order to survive. Here, we have the possibility with scholarship of making it 7/24, where you need only spend 7 hours each day in creating resources for yourself, and you can spend the other 17 hours in creative pursuits, in enjoyment of life, in savoring all the varied riches this world has to offer, which have become so much more dramatic and elusive over the past 3 months. So I think moving the world from 24/7 to 7/24 is a possibility inherent in the ideas that Dr. Pentland suggested to us, that all the discussions related to, and which I hope that we at the United Nations, working with Tuan and the Boston Global Forum, will be able to continue to solidify in the months and years ahead. Thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you again on the next occasion. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.